Go ahead, Tim.
All right. Hey, thanks everyone for joining. This is our fourth installment of the seminars on governance and digital policy, working in the digital workplace and empowering the digital workspace. Thanks to Dave for these continuing sessions, and I'll just give some foreshadowing and then some background here. You know, we met a few weeks ago, starting with just some very core questions that we want to deal with whenever describing the digital workspace, and then move from there into some information on how you provision, ensuring the right people get the right information at the right time. From there, we started talking more on the governance side, talking about enterprise decisions that need to be made, and gave you a flavor for that. Today, you know, this is one of my favorite sessions, Dave. I have to admit that if you don't have the right players in the right place at the right time, it makes this transformation, any transformation, especially when the change is vast, to make it successful. Today we're going to be talking about governance policy, but more specifically roles and responsibilities and the skill sets that team members need. So if you'll remember, everyone, the world is changing, and it's changing fast, and because of this, you know, some folks might be left behind. There's going to be winners and losers. To assure that that doesn't happen, we contend that a governance policy is needed in your business, large and small. And Dave and I have a prescription that can really help. We have the cure for some of these items because we've been there and done that. And we again thank you for your time. And with that, Dave, let's dig into the roles and responsibilities, because this is an awesome subject.
You bet, Tim, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody and have that conversation. Tim, I think thank you. That was a great segue into exactly what we want to cover here today, and I hope that we're able to answer some of the questions that you might have, but also to open up the opportunity for additional questions that may be available that you haven't thought about asking before. And one of the often overlooked areas in which that companies stop to think about is, how is this affecting my employee base? What are the new roles and responsibilities that I'm going to be asking my people to do? You know, we've come through a digital transformation where we have moved from a hard copy, paper-based filing system into putting things into a file share organization and being able to digitize a lot of what we operate with. And we're using applications to create new forms, and we're filling those out and creating big data opportunities. Well, one of the things that we forget about sometimes is the fact that, how is our business operating? How are we going to change the way people do their day-to-day operations? How are we asking them to take on new support roles and additional responsibilities? And I think, Tim, that, you know, that's often not really looked at, because folks now have to understand what those new responsibilities are and how they're moving forward and how it impacts their day-to-day life, you know, when we talk about that. Let's take a look at how business is supported today. We know that we rely on IT to keep the lights on. We know that they make sure that we have enough storage, that we have good connectivity in our network, that the applications that we're using on a day-to-day basis are available for us to use, and that we have the ability to search and find information when and where we need it. And that includes not only within our company, but also now that we are expanding into more of a diverse environment. Mobility is becoming more of a question. How are we finding these folks to be able to do that? You know, today we know that there are many champions that just come forward in the organization, and they help support each other. It's peer-to-peer support, oftentimes from champions who have either joined the company with previous experience, or that we have sent them out for training. And that oftentimes brings a lot of diversity and a lot of support to the organization itself. In that process, we've created some pretty extensive help desk knowledge bases. So when somebody calls in for a call center or for the help, we can call up a database that says, oh, this is how the solution should look like. This is how you solve the problem. Or as simple as, how do I change my password? We've built those systems today. Now, as we're entering into the digital workplace, there's a whole new set of rules and responsibilities, accountabilities that we need to look at. how are we going to be um, saddling someone with the additional responsibility for a digital workplace? What does that look like? What are the accountabilities for that digital workplace that are going to have to happen? We're adding new tools, new applications. What is our security going to be looking like? How are we going to be held responsible for that? And who's going to be responsible for supporting the digital workplace? And I think those things are very uh, forgotten sometimes because we say, oh, well, that'll just happen. Well, it doesn't just happen, and nor do we have the resources and responsibilities in a typical IT environment to do those kind of things on the scale and the magnitude that is oftentimes required. So today we're going to take a look at some of the roles and responsibilities that this new digital workplace brings to the organization. And we really want to look at what are the new ways that we look at the information, but also what are the new concepts about accountability. Well, let's start taking a look at some of, even an intranet roles. Who's going to be our steering committee? Who's going to be our governance committee? Who's going to be held accountable for our governance plan when we're done with it? These are questions that need to be identified, and we need to make sure that the stakeholders have the time and capacity in order to do that. We also know that we may have an intranet business owner, somebody who is responsible for the content, for publishing, for authoring, and making sure that material is relevant and appropriate, and that it is moving in a direction for the company as a business. Oftentimes you have to go back to the business and say, okay, if you're going to create content, who's your managing editors? Who's going to be the publisher of this content? Who's going to be the author of the content? And who is going to be responsible for holding that information as company appropriate and company usage? Are you going to allow visitors to add new content through an RSS feed or some type of social internet feed to that? Are you going to use anonymous visitors? And who are going to be those folks that are going to join that? In that role too, now we have a need for an information architect. Who's going to propose the taxonomy, the folksonomy? Who's going to make sure that we're using the proper language, that we're using multiple languages, for example? We need an information architect. We also need to know, and it oftentimes comes back to IT, is who's the ultimate owner? Is it the CIO? Is it the CTO? Is it an operations responsibility? Where does that accountability? Who's going to be conferred? And who's going to be informed about that information? We fall back into our traditional racy type of omelet. Based upon content managers, we also need to know who are the content authors. Who's going to put this information forward, and how is it going to be approved? And are we going to allow for a wide net of content? Are we going to, on our wikis and our blogs and our discussion forums, how is it used in Yammer for content authors? Are we allowing for a green space for folks just to open up and confer and discuss and talk about any topic that refers into the business? In order to do that, who's going to be handling training and comms? Is HR already set up to do that, or are we going to have to talk about who's going to do the training around a delve, or who's going to do the training around being a site collections administrator? How is that going to happen? Who's responsible for making sure that happens? It more than likely is not IT. And some of the new roles beyond those responsibilities for that content, as we talk about who's going to be involved, we need an executive sponsor who steps up and is very much engaged. That adds the additional responsibility. Maybe it's back to a knowledge operations officer, or puts it back in HR. Who is ultimately responsible? New time needs to be allocated to that person, and is it going to be part of their performance at the end of the year evaluation? How well did I do of the overall deployment of Office 365? What applications are actually going to be developed? Who's going to take on? Are we going to develop a whole new team, or are we going to send folks out for training? The role of information architect also includes a data steward, someone who is managing the term store, who is responsible for making sure that there is data layer protection in Yammer, and working with the product owner of Yammer for that part of it. Business owners, who's going to own the processes? Who's going to own the workflows that are involved? Who's going to make sure and manage those as well? Who's going to monitor many of the ongoing conversations in Yammer? What about Skype for Business and the conversations? Who's going to handle that? We fall back into an IT model about what infrastructure is engaged. Network is very, very important to us. We need to make sure that there is someone who is accountable and responsible, but is consulting and is informing the rest of the organization around network, firewalls, what configurations need to be changed in order to do that. Who's handling the help desk? Is that a separate business unit, or is that something that's part of our IT engagement? Who's handling help desk and making sure that all of the products are knowledge-based, and are they giving it back? And are we developing evangelists for our Office 365? Who are our champions? One of the biggest things that happened at a large energy and utilities company was that when we put in the product Yammer as part of the Office 365 tools, we actually sent folks to become champions, to be power users. And once they were identified within the business, then it was celebrated, so that we knew that there would be departmental support, and it didn't have to come back. Your first level of support was always back to your champion, to your power user, who had the training, who had the interest in actually going forward and making this happen. Any questions or concerns? Tim, any thoughts?
Yeah, Dave, what's really interesting is you see these, 10 or so different roles there. Do these roles typically equate back on a 1-to-1 ratio back to a specific department, or is it sometimes one to many?
Well, that's a decision that needs to be asked, and decision that needs to be made, is who actually owns Office 365 and the content and the value of Office 365. If we're asking business to take this on, some of these new roles, some of these new responsibilities then become part of the business, and it needs to be down to a level that each individual department, each individual division, each individual sub-company within a larger organization has responsibilities for that. So it's very important that that decision is made up front, because now not only are you having to impact the employee's time during the day, but you're asking them to do things that they didn't originally have as part of their overall job role and the responsibilities. So you're right. Where does the responsibility lie? And a decision needs to be made around who's going to take on this responsibility and how are you going to handle that. And there's multiple ways to look at that. Often with the companies that we have worked with, we often find that it is in the best interest to empower the business units, departments, even down to the individuals, empower them to take responsibility and take that. And what we have found is that HR then rewrites the job descriptions and the job roles and responsibilities so that it includes maybe 10% of their time is for being a site collections administrator, or 5% of their time is for being the department's SharePoint designer who handles any branding that needs to go on. How does security add this additional role of Office 365 for multi-factor authentication, monitoring and managing? How do they add these additional things? It becomes additional roles and responsibilities, Tim. And I think you're absolutely spot on in asking that question. Thanks for asking.
Exactly, Dave, and I got a couple more comments that will come right into play here. True or false, you only have to do capacity planning once you're above 100% capacity. Well, the answer, of course, is false. The more you get ahead of this, the more advantageous it is. And frankly, how often have you seen it where a project, program, or any one of these endeavors becomes a collateral duty for someone and they're already at 100% capacity? We want to avoid those issues right up front. I've seen it a lot, and it's so easy to avoid. We want to avoid that up front. That's the takeaway here. And then lastly, to put the whole team at ease, is this is easier than it sounds, and it's not like just rote work here, but if you ask these departments what their vision is, that stuff is usually there. And the trick here then and the special sauce that's added is the alignment with this endeavor. It's pulling all that so it's in a common language and pulling it together so that it's in a common common format, so everybody is working as one. So that's the takeaway here. And so great work, Dave. Please continue with some of the more interesting stuff here on site roles.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of our site roles that we need to look at, especially if we're dealing with multiple environments and across the globe, we often need to empower these organizations to handle that. We'll talk a little bit about what those responsibilities are, and then their level of responsiveness needs to be engaged as well. And so when we look at these different roles, there's many different roles within each of these boxes in these tiles. And when you look at something like a site member who is a contributor, what does that mean? Again, it falls back to our previous conversations around access. Is a particular site member going to be given the responsibility of being a contributor? And what does that mean? What's the impact to their day-to-day life? And where do we start? And how does that make sense? Because we need to define that up front. Like Tim had said, capacity planning is not something you do when it becomes a critical aspect of folks are getting burned out and they're burning the candle at both ends. So very important that we think about this up front. When we talk about Office 365, we need to be able to talk about who's the business owner for the solution that we're looking at. If it's dealing with workflows, and those workflows deal with a list within SharePoint, we need to be able to have someone who knows and understands not only how to create the workflow and whether we're using it out of the box, but we also need to go back to a product owner. And this is a new role and responsibility. So if someone is the product owner of SharePoint, they should have knowledge, training, and certification around everything that they need to go. They need to know who the go-to people are. If you're using a third-party product like Nintex for workflow, okay, who is the product owner for that, and how does it interface with SharePoint, and who's going to make sure that we train and know how to use that, because business will use it and they will keep it going. The other aspect of it is who has technical management of the total ecosystem. What network hardware is involved? What software have we bolted on to Office 365? If we have new web parts that we're adding, who's vetting those web parts out? What are some of the new features? And if we are down the road and we have a good implementation that's been going, what new code enhancements are being added to that? We know Microsoft is constantly upgrading and improving it. Okay, what are those changes? Who's going to be technically managing that from the back end? It's a whole new role, responsibility that comes along with Office 365. The other aspect to that is evaluation. Who's going to be making sure that what we are doing is the right thing? Have we added the right stuff to our environment? And who is going back and making sure that we are meeting the business needs? Oftentimes, IT will think, oh, great, new shiny tool, looking like good stuff. I want to make it, aspect very helpful. But you know what? Nobody in business even knows about it, nor do they really need it. So do we really want to implement it? So that constant feedback with business is very, very important. The other aspect of this, and why I put cat in the hat there, is it solely the responsibility again of IT, or are they responsible for making sure things are working and the lights are on? And where does the line draw between who's responsible for content in SharePoint, for example, or in Yammer, or in Skype for Business, or on Teams? uh, who has that RACI responsibility back, and do we need to create any SLAs in regards to how quickly we return that responsibility? Because if IT is going to hold all responsibility, then that becomes a bottleneck and it becomes a real problem. And again, we want to delegate out that training, and we want to make sure that we have the proper infrastructure put together. That doesn't mean that we're building it out on-prem. That means that we are allocating resources and quotas within our Office 365 ecosystem to make it happen. Here, for example, in the last line here, um, who's going to have the responsibility for creating and managing security on their sites? Is it solely the responsibility of security? Is it a responsibility for granting access given to the divisional managers who will say, yep, you are now a contributor, or no, I'm going to pull back your design access, I'm going to pull it back to read view. Where do we want that responsibility? Again, do we have the capability and the capacity to manage that in IT? Oftentimes, we need to empower our business to be able to make those decisions. Who's going to be responsible for the ultimate security? Of course, we know our security department is ultimately handling that for us, but what can we take on from a business standpoint? One of the biggest things also is information architecture, is who's handling metadata, because that affects our ultimate KPI for the use of Office 365 is findability. How quickly are people able to find and use and manage the data that we have put up there? What central control system do we have over what values go into site columns, for example, if we're tagging something in with a metadata tag and creating it? Again, who's responsible for that? Are we going to bring that down to the individual employee level and put it in document properties? Or are we actually asking someone like a data steward, who is a new role responsibility, that will be taking that on to make sure it's tagged? Or are we lucky enough to have auto tagging done through a bolt-on software system that allows us to do that? Again, these are new responsibilities. If we're collaborating, who's going to be responsible for not only creation, authoring, publishing, and managing? So those are new roles, if we don't already have them, and they may be new responsibilities that need to go into a person's performance review at the end of the year. Any questions or thoughts?
No, it's just a continued opportunity for folks to, enhance their careers and just keep moving that right direction. But Dave, do you have at hand, some of the statistics of lost productivity due to finding that darn document that you worked on last week that you can't find? Some of it's staggering. I think you probably have some insight to that.
Well, we did a study at one of the utility companies that we were asked to bring in both Yammer and SharePoint, as well as some of the early Office 2013 things. What we found is that folks were spending between 7 to 8 minutes every hour, trying to find information that they needed to get to. And when we accumulated that over a period of time with 1,200 employees, now you start looking at loss of productivity in not the number of hours or minutes, but in the actual loss of productivity and efficiency in days. And when we explored that and extrapolated that out, the lost productivity was in the tens of days of time across the organization in just trying to find material and be able to pull it back and use it. And what we found is that the employee base will say, I can't find it, and I don't know where it's at. It's over here in this other ECRM product. It's not in SharePoint. I can't find it. It's not relevant. I'm just going to recreate it. And so oftentimes there again, we're finding rework is much more expensive because folks were having to reinvent the wheel, create something they couldn't find, and the loss of thousands of dollars of time, not only in the rework, but also in the lack of ability to find that material. So, Tim, I can certainly point those out at another time, but as we'll talk more about information architecture and how do we improve that findability capability. Does that help answer the question?
Right. And so, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for elaborating, because everything counts in large amounts, and we're talking about very real and measurable things with just that type of metadata and speed and efficiencies. I mean, there's many others that we'll discuss, but just wanted to make that exclamation point. Thanks, Dave.
You bet. What are some of the existing organizational roles mapped to roles that are required in the new solution? There may be folks that are already information managers or that deal with content publishing and security, and what are the levels of types of documents within that? How does that map from what we're asking folks to take on for Office 365, and how does that map to the new roles and responsibilities that we need in order to meet the digital workplace solution? Do we need to hire additional new resources to do this? Are folks already burning the candle at both ends? Are we now asking them to do that? What types of training is going to be involved, and what is the impact to our business if we're going to be sending folks out to be trained? That needs to be accounted for. We need to ask those questions up front, and we need to prepare for that opportunity for training and certifications, and also the fact that there may be folks out there that we need to bring in to train these folks. We want to make sure that we're capturing our lessons learned along every aspect of this, because that becomes an invaluable tool for us to be able to do onboarding of new employees as well as preparing for those new roles and responsibilities. Again, simplifying it down into SharePoint, dealing with site owners. Do they need to be employees? Let me give you the example back to when a contractor was hired into a company that had the ability to get in to the DoD SharePoint environments, which held a tremendous amount of data, not only private but confidential information to the government. They brought in a contractor to be a site collections owner and then turned that information over to them. And if you remember, the gentleman's name was Edward Snowden. And when that happened, he had access to all of that information. You want to make sure that you either have a fully vetted contractor who has goals and responsibilities, or do you really want to keep that with your employees? Very, very important, and we've learned a lot of lessons that we need to make sure that we are including in our conversations going forward. So please remember that. Who has responsibility, and to what level of responsibility are we looking at? Any questions?
No, I don't have any at this time. Just can't wait for the next piece here, Dave.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I appreciate that. I think we covered a little bit about roles and responsibilities. We want to make a decision. Are they an employee, or can we bring in a contractor? The employees, do we train them and empower them to be able to do the things that we want them to do? Or do we actually have someone we have to bring in as either a company or a contractor to give them access, even down to the point where what applications are we actually going to be doing it with? Let's talk a little bit about once we've set up our roles and responsibilities. The last section I want to talk a little bit about is what are some of our general policies, kind of wrapping up about this governance questions and policy questions, so we can get into the real nuts and bolts of governance and dealing with access of security and compliance and provisioning and branding and user experience. We'll get into those nuts and bolts in the following webinars, but just kind of to summarize back a little bit about what we've been talking about. Some of the real key points that I wanted to make sure we covered again. Who's gonna deploy this type of app, and what is it going to be deployed? Are we going to make sure that training has been provided before we deploy it, or are we going to deploy it like many companies have with Yammer, where it just becomes a green space and everybody starts out and then we pull it back in a little bit, or we apply administration and we provide the guardrails and the boundaries going forward? What's the approval process going to have to go through? Are we going through our governance committee, to our stakeholders, to maybe if it's something that is a full application in Office 365, like Delve or Yammer, are we actually going to our business board of directors to say, okay, here's what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is what we believe that will add to the company, and we need your approval on that final bit. How critical is availability of these? Many times when we talk about SharePoint, we don't think about it being a tier 1 application, but guess what? We're putting tier 1 content in an ECRM product like SharePoint and Office 365. It now becomes a tier 1, and it has very specific SLAs, and it requires responsive time to that site to be backed up and reestablished. We have a whole lot of new responsibilities and roles that may need to be engaged. Who's going to monitor the content? Who's going to be your monitors for Yammer? Is the business going to monitor at the divisional level or the departmental level? Are individuals going to be good corporate citizens that will be held accountable for the content? Recently, we just found out that if you put something out in a tweet and you're going to be held accountable, you'll basically lose your entire likelihood of continued employment for what you put into that. So we need to see somebody monitoring that, quarantining it. That's a whole new role. That's a responsibility that adds to people's work. How are we going to get feedback on how all of these tools in Office 365 are they really helping us move to a digital workplace? What is it that we're actually doing, and how is it affecting our types? And one of the other big questions that we haven't talked too much about is how do we decommission something if something's not being used? For example, in this recent retail company that we're working with, we found that Lotus Notes had Quicker sites and team sites that had been there for tens of years, and no one even knew they existed until we ran an inventory program and said, do you really need this? Well, it was costing them storage and SAN costs. How do we deal with that? That's a whole new responsibility, may add additional role, or it may be additional responsibility given back to somebody who needs to be working on that process. Who's going to be assigning permissions? Are we going to put that back on the business to a site collections administrator who is going to then trickle down into their team site owners who says, oh, you can be a contributor today, or maybe you have full control? Who's going to be dealing with that? You give it back to IT again, and it becomes a 3-month bottleneck in order to get that out. And this is time and time and time again that we have seen that happen. Who can publish content? Who can pull content back? Who can edit content? These are things that we need to be talking about right up front, and who's going to be able to manage that. I'm sure that we're doing that in advertising and marketing today to make sure that we have that. Are we going to allow external users to have access to our Office 365 internal sites through a VPN? What tool solution and specific restrictions do we have? Any questions or concerns around permissions that we've covered in the past?
No, but I will hammer home. I was at a major insurance company recently where I had the unduly task of taking Quicker sites and migrating them. It's a bigger task than you can imagine. Just doing some of that migrations and such like that. It's just very, very amazing. Dave? Dave?
Tim, I apologize. I was talking to mute there for just a moment. That was a great example.
Oh, yes,
I appreciate that. Really a good example of exactly where that was holding. The other part, the last part of permissions, is dealing what are the restrictions or guardrails that we need to put in place. Who, for our product owners, we need them to be able to be ultimately accountable and responsible for the product, not the content. And who's providing that solution? We often find that companies, for example, much like what you just talked about, Tim, is that Folks are not aware of the solution that already exists within the Office 365 ecosystem. And we need to make sure that our product owners are out there as our champions for their product and that they are getting the newest and latest updates from things going forward. So good example, Tim. Thank you.
Sure.
The last part that I want to just cover back again, and we'll definitely get into this in dealing with our user experience, our employee experience, and some of the things that we talk about. But SharePoint's really one of the key cornerstones of the Office 365 deployment. And one of the things is, what are we looking at? Community sites, top level sites for a portal, publishing. What's the process of requesting the use of a new tool such as SharePoint, and what are the levels that we can request and make that happen? Who's going to own that navigation? One of the things that we'll definitely cover in the days to come here in our webinars. Who's going to have that top level navigation? Is it where's it going to be? What's it going to look like? What's it going to say? How do we make sure that we're up to date and that we're working on those types of things? Are we going to allow multiple uses and different areas within that? What are our guardrails? What are our boundaries that we need to work on that going forward? What does the layout look like? And we'll be talking about that in the future here when we talk about user experience and especially employee experience. What and how do people get and come and go from the different areas within those layouts? And that includes things that we can change in dealing with many of the applications. Planner, for example. Are we going to use Planner where we lay out a Scrum workbook, or are we going to use it just as simple tasks? And we talk about groups in Outlook. How are we going to have that look and feel? How are we going to have it generate the chat capabilities in Teams? How are we going to interplay all of these things coming together? What are the specific things that can't be changed? And what are the things that we can change? So it's very important. Again, I follow back to our product owners who are going to be our subject matter experts on that particular product. And where does that person exist? Are we creating a new part of the organization called the Center of Excellence for our product owners? Or our product owner is going to be someone that we will have as part of the business, and they've taken on that role and responsibility. How are they going to come together once a month? I know one of the great things that we did at one of the universities here in Minnesota is that we took all of the site collections administrators and they added that responsibility onto their departmental chairman, and the chairperson then came together once a month. They talked about what their challenges were, what their issues were, what new things were available. The product owners got up and talked about, hey, here's a new feature within Teams, and here's how we would like you to begin to use it. And the site collections administrators then took that back to their departments and disseminated that information and worked with their champions and their peer-to-peer support system in order to make that happen. So this is where it becomes very important that we set up that ability for roles and responsibilities within, and especially in an academic environment where there is so many things that are changing consistently. One of the big areas that we are always concerned with, what's critical information? How do we create that? What are the processes for tier 1 critical content? What is our records retention policies? How are we going to apply the discipline of working with the records center in SharePoint? How are we dealing with disposition and disposal of this content? What are our management policies going to be? We need to think of these things first. We also need to think of them, as we've talked about previously, is about what exists today that I can apply to the new Office 365 ecosystem, and making sure that we handle, again, and I'm driving this home, is a lot about who owns published documents. When we give a public face to it, is it going to be an internal intranet face to it? Who's going to be contributing, maybe discussing? What are our levels of discussion? What are our levels of management of that discussion? Who's going to own the content lifecycle? Who's going to make sure that after 7 days, a document that was put up on the intranet site for the organization is changed? Because what I have seen many times in companies is that the intranet page becomes static and not dynamic, and we need to make sure that that content lifecycle management is very active and very engaging. At the same time, we need to make sure that there is an employee experience that they can do that. They are empowered to change that particular article or their departmental information. How do we handle archiving? How do we handle document versioning? Many times the folks will say, well, I want to keep 25 versions of the document so that in case something needs to be reverted back to, then I have that ability. They don't realize that anything above that is costing us storage, and we need to realize and maintain and manage that. What are the specific document policies around doing that? So there's a lot of questions that we need to ask, a lot of things that we need to consider, and if we don't do it up front, then folks are going to invent it themselves. They're going to change it themselves. If we don't ask these questions up front and make sure that we're all on the same plateau. That's kind of ending our conversation here a little bit early today. If you have any questions, please contact Tim or myself. We really appreciate this first opportunity to go through these first four really critical questions and policy things that we need to address. So Tim, with that, I'll turn it back to you, and if anyone has any questions or concerns and comments that they wish to make, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Dave, for that insight. I know it's kind of funny, and we did this a little more pointed, but really roles and responsibilities is paramount to what's being built, and especially in any governance discussions that you're having about adopting this digital workplace. Foreshadowing, Dave, what's up next week? Can you recall?
We definitely want to talk a little bit about security and compliance, I believe. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts, talking about what are the things that we can do within Office 365 ecosystem to assure that we're dealing with that. We'll talk a little bit about the administrative portal. We'll introduce you to some of the E5 administration and compliance capabilities that Office 365 have. We'll talk about the differences dealing with the enterprise mobility system that we can put in place that puts Intune, and it puts the additional capability to reach out to our mobility clients and work with them, and not only empowering, but also be able to manage that when we have someone who is offboarding, or especially when we're onboarding someone as well. So we'll be talking a little bit more about what are the expectations, what are the capabilities, more than what the questions are, but what are the capabilities that we need to be looking at. And the hope is that we'll describe some of the functions, the features, and what the potential benefits are, but we really want to drive home the fact that, hey, did you know this was out there, and you need to be making a decision on whether that's enabled or disabled, or that you're going to use it. And that's what the hope is, that during this conversation, we not only show you a little bit about, okay, now let's go forward and make these decisions, but also pointing out to you that there are things that you need to be aware of about the decisions that you need to be making. And it really opens up, I've done this multiple times, and it really opens a lot of folks' eyes to the fact that, oh, I didn't know that was there. I didn't know I was able to do that. Or, hey, I think that's something we should have. Well, that opens up a whole new door of additional questions that we need to address. And that's kind of what the next series through the summer of webinars, as I say, Tim, we'll discuss. And we'll really talk about the function, features, and benefits So that's what's on the agenda next, Tim.
Outstanding. Well, thanks so much, and we'll continue. We've got several more of these that'll even get even more detail. We thank you for your attendance, and as always, contact us if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thanks
Thanks for attending.
You bet.
All right.
Hang on one sec. I got to stop the recording and use the